If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, I must tell you I'm excited. Ever since we started Legacy, we had people asking about the Bushman Battalion. That is 3-1 Battalion. Now that's a famous battalion. And we honor today, we have a commander of 3-1 Battalion here with us. He's Colonel Brian Adams. I don't think, sir, that you are related to the singer, the Canadian one. I will ask you about that further. No, he says no, not at all. Now, we're going to deal with 3-1 Battalion next week in the second episode. I'll tell you why. Once these people start taking over battalions, they are highly experienced officers. They are chosen men, otherwise they wouldn't be there. And we need to understand, where does this man come from? What made him a soldier? Why? I mean, perhaps his parents were in the army, perhaps something. We need to understand the man. We need to understand what happened. So very welcome here, Colonel. May I ask you, where do you come from? How did you end up in the army?
Yeah, it's a great story, Chris. I like many South Africans, my family came here in many ways. My earliest that we can work out was a descendant of Sergeant Major Thomas Adams, who was a Sergeant Major on St. Helena when Napoleon was there, when he was incarcerated there from 1815. And the first resident that actually came to South Africa was his son, Thomas John, who arrived here at the end of the 18th century. There were those to and fro between the Dutch and the British at that time. And so he was one of the settlers. Then we had others that came from Scotland in the early 1800s. On my mom's side, they came in the mid 1800s from Scotland and one part from England. And so it was this kind of melting pot of European Protestants that make up my background. And thanks to my late cousin Marcel, her fantastic work over a number of years, we've been able to trace back our history to nearly 1,000 years. And I'm not going to go into detail because it sounds as if I'm bragging, but what I can tell you is that many generations were involved in various battles. In fact, my grandfather, George Michael, believe it or not, they talk about using singers' names, but he's George Michael Adams. He's my grandfather. He was involved in the First World War and the Second World War. And I've got a fantastic photograph of him on his motorbike in the mud in France, in Flanders, in the First World War. And it's actually a lovely story because he joined up when he was far too young, and he had to spend a year in Egypt while they were building up the forces to send across to France. And when he eventually got over there, he and his mates were billeted with a family in Belgium in the Ardennes area. And the family were moved up to the top floor, and the soldiers were in the ground floor and the first floor. And he obviously, being a young red-blooded South African chappie, had a relationship with the owner's daughter, Marcel. And at the end of the war, he came back to South Africa, was demobilized, got onto a subsequent ship and went back to Belgium and brought my granny home. And it's a beautiful story because I actually subsequently, my wife and I went there to this little village. And she said, now, my wife said, what are you going to do? You're here now. What's the next step? So I said, well, we're going to go into the nearest pub and I'm going to speak my best French that I did at school and at university. And eventually one youngster came over here and said, what are you, welcome, and what are you doing here? I said, well, je cherche ma grand-maman. I'm looking for my grandmother. And he said, you mean Marcel, the one that went to Africa? And I said, well, there you go. And he took me up this little cobbled road to a little house and knocked on the door, and there was my granny's cousin. She was still alive at the time. And so we had a wonderful time drinking cognac and shelf temperature beer but I had an immediate link with that part of my family. So that was my grandfather, George Michael, and he had 3 sons. One of them was my dad. He was a navigator observer in bombers in the Second World War. He had a very hairy time. He was shot down twice. He had to parachute out once. His parachute was actually on fire. Still got a piece of it, of the silk parachute, in one of my trommels somewhere. And so he saw active service in North Africa and in Italy. His brother, my uncle Jimmy, was the sergeant major in the Armored Corps in the Second World War. And there's quite a lovely story about that, because there was only one pub in Egypt, or in Cairo, where officers and NCOs were allowed to mix. And somebody will be able to help me, but I can't remember the name of the pub. It might have been the Australian or the Anzac pub, quite possibly. Anyway, one Saturday evening, my dad and his mates were sitting on the bar stools, and suddenly my dad had this arm around his neck and was pulled off his bar stool. And then there was almost like inevitably going to be a bit of a punch-up, until he realized that it was his brother that had come into the pub and recognized him and was saying hello to him. So the next day, then my uncle told my dad that their dad was actually in town. He was in the Second World War as well, but not in a combat role. He was in a support role. He was actually in stores, those massive big stores and depots and stuff that they had there. So the next day was a Sunday, and they went to go and visit the old man. Interestingly, my gran, who was a French-speaking Belgian, the marriage to my grandfather didn't last long. It lasted about 8 years or 9 years or so, and eventually the third son, Michael, who I'm named after, my second name is Michael. He was kicked in the leg basically, and he had to go to Europe to have an operation, and his leg was slightly smaller than another. So he stayed in France for quite a few years, or in Europe, and he eventually became a member of the resistance, the Maquis. And I'm very happy that nobody at military intelligence ever discovered that when they were doing my clearance, because I think he was actually probably a communist and certainly a member of the underground in the Maquis. So no matter what role they played, whether it was in the flying crew of a bomber or some other form, my family have been in soldiering for a long time. The other thing is that my dad, like most of his generation, they never really talked about their time in the war. We had to really, when he and his mates came around and had the equivalent of what today is probably a bribe, it was difficult to get stuff out of them. They didn't ever talk about the difficulties they'd had. And some of them, I was born in 1952, so it was only 7 years after the end of the war. So for a lot of the guys, it was a very raw story. It was very fresh, and it was very current. But I grew up in Rondebosch in Cape Town, right next to the high school. And from the time I was about 4, 5, 6 years old, my brother and I used to stroll across to the school when they had cadets. And we were fascinated by the cadets and the cadet band and everything. And so we were kind of unwittingly, perhaps, attracted to soldiering in those early days. Also, because of the school I went to, we had an opportunity to do a lot of hiking and mountain climbing and getting out into the bush. So for me, that was an absolutely brilliant kind of trade-off, in the sense that I was not only living in the city, but I was going to a school where we were able to do a lot of visits to mountains and outside places and things like that. Also, of course, in those early days, in the early 60s, mid-60s, a lot of my cousins and my friends and their older brothers were starting their national service. It was the early days of the 9-month training, the ballot. And so these guys used to come back on weekend passes and all that, and they would be in their smart uniforms and lekker windgat. And we would really look up to these guys and say, well, I want to be a paratrooper too, or I want to do that, or I want to do the other thing. So it was really a convergence, I suppose, of a whole lot of stuff that led to me being very attracted to a career in the military. The other thing was, in 1968 and 1969, I was able to, or privileged actually, to spend a lot of time traveling around what was then Rhodesia and Mozambique. And that included visiting some friends of mine there whose family were involved in the war, and in Rhodesia then and in Mozambique. So I was able to interact with the wartime kind of environment and what was going on, and also it didn't really scare me off. Actually, the opposite. It was actually more attractive to me, which sounds really counterintuitive, but being the kind of guy that I was, perhaps it was a natural thing to do. You might remember in those days that there was an option for us. I'm talking about 1969 when I finished school. You could either accept the call up that you got and do your 1 year and then do your 5 years camps or whatever it is, or you could go to university first and then you could do your 15 years of camps and so on. And I had an arrangement with my dad, and that was that while I was passing at university, he would keep paying, but when I stopped passing, then I was out. I had to go and look after myself, find a bursary or find somebody else to help fund the thing. So at that stage, I don't know why I decided, but I got a call up from 2SSB in Zeerust, and I immediately decided, not because of it being 2SSB, there was nothing about 2SSB that scared me, in fact, except that it was a long way from Cape Town, where I obviously grew up. But I decided then I was going to go and study. So my call-up was changed, and I ended up going the Donitron Combat School, Discorbelos route, which actually is, looking back, was actually amazing, because what I didn't say was that last week, Friday, was the 30th anniversary of the last day that I served in the South African Defence Force. And I've had an opportunity to look back because I'm writing some of the stories down that I experienced over my short career. My career was only 22 years, from the time that I did basic training until the time that I left in 1992. So unlike some of my colleagues who stayed on until they were 55 or even older, my career was actually nipped in the bud at quite an early age. So, what I did afterwards is actually probably more material, but my dream was to become a soldier. And I think the fact that I had an opportunity to leave when I did in 1992 was heaven sent, in a sense, because I didn't see a future for myself under the new regime, if you like. But I did get the call up eventually to go to the Discorbelos. And what I realized, thinking about it, as I was starting to say, is that in those days, the commandos were all volunteers. It was the old skitpitter, as we used to call it. It was the old farmers, that had the skit clubs, and they used to get a free rifle, and they were there like a sort of militia, and they were extremely successful in the history of South Africa. As you know, in the Boer War days, they were absolutely mind-boggling soldiers. But in the early 60s, there was a big problem, because the South African Defence Forces, we knew it in the 1990s or 1980s during Packer and Hooper and those operations, where it was at its peak probably. When I did my basic training in 1970, it was a long, long way from where it ended up in the 1980s. And the commandos were really manned by volunteers. A lot of them were older guys. A lot of them had done virtually no military training. They got there because they were the richest farmer in the district, or whatever the case was, or they were a member of a secret organization, which we won't talk about today. But however may, they did their job and whatever. But I noticed, looking back, that the era that I started, or my group started in the 1970s, was the transformation of the whole commando system from a volunteer plodding along system into a proper section and a part of the Defence Force. So a lot of people have said to me, aren't you ashamed that you came in through the back door like that? Well, I'm not. Initially, the fact that I had to wear that skip pit badge was not really where I wanted to be, but it turned out perfectly fine for me. So I'm going to touch on some of the things that happened to me during this period, and I hope they're going to be of interest to other people that might have been there at the same time, or even youngsters today who might be thinking of a military career, because I think it's one of the best careers that you can have. You either like it or you don't. It's not something that that is forced on you like it was on a lot of us. But the fact that I was conscripted was actually playing into my hands, because I was called up in the winter of 1970 where we did basic training. Well, I can tell you, it was, if you wanted to talk about a rude awakening, that was a rude awakening. Because myself and a whole lot of UCT and Stellenbosch mates got on the train from the castle. We walked from the castle to the railway station, got on the train and arrived in Kimberley. And it was freezing cold in Kimberley. We were told that we weren't allowed to have alcohol on the train, but of course we all smuggled alcohol on the train. So we didn't know much about the train trip, but we got a huge rude awakening when we arrived there, because it looked like, you know, those movies you see of the concentration camps in Germany, where the doors of the trucks open and there's snow and there are people with German Shepherd dogs, armed soldiers. Well, that was like at Kimberley Station. We got the fright of our lives. From the moment we got off the train, we were shouted at, pushed, shoved, cajoled, whatever the word is, and eventually we must have looked like refugees, because we all had our kit. I remember one guy even brought his guitar with him. One guy brought his golf clubs. So I don't know where they thought they were going, but anyway, we were eventually chucked onto the back of these Bedfords, and we had our roofie ride. And honestly, I don't know how we all arrived in one piece at the base, because it was hair raising. And I made the decision then and there that if I ever was in a position where I could influence that kind of thing, I would stop it in its tracks, because it was just completely, I mean, everybody thought it was a big joke and it was a lot of fun and games, but in retrospect, it was extremely irresponsible and something that I would have nipped in the bud had I had an opportunity. So Discoblos in those days is to the south or east of Kimberley. It used to be an industrial school many years ago, and before that, it was the site of the South African Air Force, where the South African Air Force was started. And as you might know, the South African Air Force is the second oldest air force in the world after the Royal Air Force, which is something which we should be so proud of, but which I think has been just forgotten in the annals of time. But anyway, this place was it was a dreadful place. It looked like, honestly, it looked like a concentration camp. It was bitterly cold. There were these long rondavels, which each took probably, must have been close to 80 or 90 guys in long rows. It was not like your normal bungalow that I subsequently saw in other training bases. These were like workshops that had been converted. And of course, being the army, they had to leave the windows open, because the windows ensured that we had fresh air. So even though it was -6 outside or -5 outside, there were these guys not even sleeping in their beds, because, as you know, most of us used to sleep on the floor, because we daren't mess up our bed, because that was going to be inspected the next morning. So the fire buckets were frozen, the windows were open, we were sleeping on the floor, and it was a massive rude awakening to a lot of us. I was quite a tough guy in those days, in the sense that I'd spent a lot of time hiking and I'd done that kind of stuff. So for me, I wasn't brought up in a protected environment. I was brought up in a fantastic home, but it was certainly not protected. My dad insisted that we became Boy Scouts and that we learned how to do stuff. So I was able to sew my buttons on my greatcoat, where some of my mates who came from very spoiled backgrounds weren't even able to sew their buttons on or to sort their kit out to iron or anything like that. So that was it. So then, you know, the biggest problem was the barbers, because there was obviously this thing that our intake was student intake. So there was obviously this huge cultural issue between hierdie communiste wat hier aantree, these communists that have arrived from UCT and even from Stellenbosch in those days. These students are going to be taught a serious lesson here. So the first opportunity was the barbershop. And there were these civvy barbers that used to come through on contract and cut hair there. And we were absolutely skulled. It was just a complete number one, and we were back to completely shaved heads. It was so bad that a lot of us got lost, because we went back to the bungalow and we didn't recognize any of our mates, because we thought we were in the wrong bungalow. So anyway, to cut a long story short, there were a couple of guys from Durban with long blonde surfer hair. I'll never get the one guy, they shaved everything off, except they left 2 little ponytails. And they made him walk around for a couple of days like that until the RSM found out about it and sent him back to have his head shaved. But, there was no human rights in those days in the army. I mean, from there we went to have our injections. And it was a thing that looked like a revolver. It had about 5 needles in it. And they used to push it against your arm and then pull the trigger, and you'd get this whack. And then the big joke then, of course, was that you had to go to the QM store to get your kit, and everything was done on the double. So we just had this 5 shots in the arm, end up at the QM store, and now we've got this trommel and this bowl suck, and we've got to run back to our rendezvous with all this kit. And it was very amusing to the instructors to see how many guys actually fainted and passed out along the way, because actually in retrospect it was bloody stupid. But at the time, it was probably something that nobody really worried about. We got our kit, and as usual, it was military medium, or what we used to call size fit. These guys in the stores, they were experts. They would look a guy up and they would tell you exactly whether he was a large or a medium or a size 8 boot or whatever the case was. Anyway, we would chuck all our stuff. We were given an opportunity to run back to our bungalow, and we got there, and then we were cleared on again, and we were sent off for our meal. And by then we were pretty hungry, because many of us, certainly my mates from the train, still had a serious hangover. And we were starving because we hadn't had anything to eat the whole day. So when we got to the kitchen, it was delightful. Little did we know that we weren't always going to be as happy to see the food as we were. And what I tried to say in the beginning, there were a lot of things that were shocking in those days. I mean, our equipment, you can't actually explain to anybody the transition that we did from 1970 to 1980. The 10 years, our army grew, and it's got to be a lot of thanks has got to be given to guys like General Malan and others who were at the forefront of modernizing our defense force. Because a lot of people are not going to believe what I'm going to say, but we got our webbing that we had was Second World War webbing. It was the old. If you look at World War II pictures, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It was old webbing, and I'll never get one of the guys freaked out completely because his backpack had holes in it, bullet holes in it. So it was obvious that this had been stuff that had been recovered after the war, had been scrubbed and cleaned and put back into the store. We all wore those khaki overalls. We had one set of 8-stupper, which was there were no browns in those days. It was a pair of sort of khaki long pants and a khaki shirt with a tie and a bunny jacket. That was our 8-stup. When I think back, it was a long, long way from where we were in the middle of the 80s when we closed down shop, basically. So yeah, we had our dinner. We were introduced to the farpan. We were introduced to main dish, as we called it, which was bread, because you always filled up on main dish because you were running around like we do, expending a lot of energy. We needed that starch. We needed those carbs, and so main dish was something that we looked for and found and consumed by the handful. We were also introduced to a thing called Katifi. We had these stainless steel things which they used to bring out to the field, full of a brew, which looked like coffee or looked like tea, whichever way you looked at it. It was either tea with milk or coffee. And because the same containers were used for coffee and tea, it eventually developed a sort of a combined taste, which we called Katifi, because you never knew whether you were having tea or coffee. So you drank it because it was sweet and hot. And then, of course, there was all the suspicion about the blowfitriol, what is it called in English? The copper sulfate, which was added to the tea, which was supposed to bring down everybody's libido. And we all discussed that. And somebody said to me the other day, this business of the stuff they gave us when we were 18 or 19 is actually true. The big problem is that it only starts working when you get to the age of 70. But anyway, be that as it may, we were introduced to all these things, and we started out on our journey. As I mentioned, it was freezing cold, and we had at the time we had most of us actually came from Cape Town, and so we had when we got home, it was actually so bad. So many of us were sick. Some guys even were hospitalized with pneumonia, and it was even in the newspaper to say where were these guys? What were they up to? That they were so ill when they came back. But there was no mercy, whether it was hot or cold. In that time, we did our first session of basic, because the way it worked, as I said in those days, you had your 1 month basic. Then in the same year, you had your second period of basic, and then you had your caps. And I realized pretty soon that there was no way that I was going to go through 16 years of being bossed around by people who I didn't always. I decided pretty soon that I was going to make an effort to get into the leadership, the leader group stream. And so the second training, the second course, or the second thing that I did in 1970 was at the end of the year, in the summer, and that was what was then called the section leaders course. And that was really a step up from the initial period where we were. Just to tell you some more stories about the initial period, it was an amazing experience for me, because even though I came from a family where my dad was very fluent, very bilingual, because of the school I went to, we had boarders from the Karoo and all over. So I wasn't completely not exposed to Afrikaans-speaking kids, or kids who were first language Afrikaans speakers, put it that way. But my opportunity in Kimberley was my exposure to a lot of guys from Stellenbosch particularly, who were, and it was an opportunity for me to get to know these guys, and it was a fantastic experience. And what was really nice about it is, even though there were some idiots there that were always playing the language card, for most of us, it was an opportunity to pull together, to get involved, to get to know each other, and it was a great time together. But the one thing that stood out for me was there was obviously a bit of a class gap between us, some of us who came from middle class sort of backgrounds, to some guys who were really not necessarily from the same strata. And I don't want to sound like a snob, but anything but that. But it was a huge exposure for me, because there was in our bungalow there was this one guy who never bathed, never washed, and I don't blame him, because it was freezing cold there. I mean, the water was, by the time the first 3 or 4 guys had gone through the shower, there was no hot water left. And I'll never forget one day, some of the Stellenbosch guys got hold of this chap and dragged him into the shower with a couple of scrubbing brushes that you use on the floor. And they scrubbed him until he was blue, virtually. Anyway, that was a lesson for everybody, because as far as I remember, after that, everybody seemed to suddenly take an interest in their personal hygiene. But we had all these old tricks that everybody knows about, where we cut a blanket into little pieces about that size, and they were called taxis, and we used to slide around on the floor with them, and that became part of our culture. We used to keep them in our pockets, and as soon as we came in from wherever we'd been, put them on the floor and skate around. So the floor of the lino floor was absolutely perfect and brilliant. I had a guy who was next to me in my bungalow. He was at school with me. He eventually became a civil engineer, but he came from a very, very privileged background. One would almost say he was very spoiled. And it was this basic training was to him a huge, huge rude awakening. He was a slapgat, basically. I was at school with him for 12 years. In fact, we were at the same preschool together. And he refused to sleep on the floor. So his bed was always like a dog show. And he was like Sad Sack. He just looked a shambles. And I'll never forget one day, we really prided ourselves on our standards, especially guys like me who were trying to sort of do well so that we would get into the leadership stream and so on. And one day this sergeant came down inspecting I must say it was excellent, until he got to my mate's bed next to me. And then he nearly broke his neck when he looked at this bed. And we'd all try to help because we knew what was going to happen. If we didn't sort this thing out, we were going to be in big trouble. Anyway, so the staff sergeant or sergeant, whatever it was, jumped up on the bed with his big paratrooper boots, started stripping the sheets, stomping all over the pillow, and generally making a mess of it. So the staff said to him, "Now, what have you got to say for yourself?" And my friend Andrew said, "Well, I suppose you think that's funny." Oh, geez, well, that was the worst thing that he could have possibly said, because we were all cleared on outside for a good oppie, for a good half an hour oppie, and then we learned a couple of very important lessons there. Don't get smart. Don't try and outsmart the instructor. Go along with it. Stick together, and together you'll overcome this whole issue. So that brought us to the whole lesson around volunteering. You know, one of the things which my dad and my uncle and everybody and my cousins and everybody said, one thing you learn when you get to the army: never volunteer for anything. Never volunteer. So there were these guys that were caught out all the time. The sergeant would come in at night time and say, "Any electrical engineers here?" And a couple of guys would put up their hands, and then they say, "Right, your job now is to turn out the lights every night. When everybody's in bed, you've got to get up out of your bed and go and turn off the lights." And then there was the guy, "Any driver's licenses?" And everybody thought that was the opportunity now to become a driver. Right, get that broom over there and drive this broom around the rondavel. Around the bungalow. That's your job for the next year. But one friend of mine, he was an electrical engineer in Vorden. And when the sergeant came in on another occasion and said, "Are there any electrical experts here?" He put up his hand, and we were all nudging him and saying, "Don't volunteer, man." Anyway, he volunteered. And he fell with his backside in the butter, because the one sergeant was a very keen Scalectric chap. And he had this massive Scalectric thing in his house. And he needed this guy who was a trained sparky. He needed him to go around and help him after hours, connect all his stuff and everything. So this guy used to get like a civvy food, a home cooking, all cake and from the sergeant's wife and everything. So he actually proved that sometimes it's a good idea to volunteer. I'll never forget one morning it must have been about 4:30, it was freezing cold. And some of us, the Corp 2 guys, we'd finished what we were, our beds were ready. We were ready for the inspection. And the corporal came in and said, "Right, anybody finished?" And a couple of us stupidly put up our hands, and he said, "Right, come." There were about 3 or 4 of us, and he said, "Right, start raking up the leaves here." So we all said, "Oh, give us the rakes." He said, "No, the rakes." Yes, like, and then he died, man. It was freezing cold leaves that we had to grab with our hands and whatever. But anyway, it's another lesson, and it was all the whole idea to make us just kind of like dumb down a little bit. The other thing that I was volunteered for, if you like, was the fact that I was a drummer in Savvy Street, and I was also a drummer in the cadets when I was at school. So I thought, when they asked for volunteers for the band, I thought, well, what can go wrong here? You know, this is something where I can maybe get out of some of the drill and whatever. And anyway, lo and behold, being in the band was a after hours thing. There were some times when we had to rehearse and so on, but for most of the time it was an after hours thing. And I'll never forget that there was the premiere of the movie Pattern that was on in Kimberley, and we had to do the band had to perform outside the theater, the cinema, and after that we were taken aside into the hall nearby, and we were given a nice chow and looked after, and we were allowed to go back and watch the movie. But most of us were so tired, because we never got any sleep basically, that we all just slept through the whole movie. So I'll never forget that our RSM at the time was a guy by the name of Bebop Schoos, who was an absolute legend in the army in those days. And he didn't like the band. He always thought the band were a bunch of skivers. They were duckers and divers. And one day, the band must have done something to really irritate him. And he got one of the staff sergeants to yach the band around. Well, it was bad for me, because I had the side drum. But the poor guy on the bass drum, I'll never forget, he vomited 3 times. And he was eventually carried off to the sick bay. The poor guy was completely hammered. The guys with the trumpets, they laughed at us, because they were just running around doing the stuff that we all had to do, but they just had trumpets to carry. So, yeah, it was a bit of a dodgy one for that. But as I mentioned, it was bitterly cold. we had 303 rifles. That's the rifles we were issued with. And as you know, if you're on parade, the rifle is in your hand. And I'll never forget when we opened our hands after standing like at ease with our rifles over our shoulder like this. When you open your hand used to crack open. And then you go to the sick bay. And the sick bay, I can honestly say that one of the great things about our defense force, as it was later on, was the medical service. Because in those days, the doctors and stuff we had in the army, they were district surgeons. They weren't army medics or qualified army people. They were guys that used to work in the prisons and used to hand out the pills and stuff. And I'll never forget, we had the joke there about something called the mixture. Now, no matter what your illness was, no matter what your problem was, you went along and you got probably 2 pain pills and a bottle of the thing called the mixture. And the mixture was nothing other than a laxative. I'll never forget the one guy, the doctor, he was Polish or something, I remember, Greek, I can't remember. But I was in the queue there for getting something, I don't know what it was. The guy looked at this bottle and he said, "But doctor, this is a laxative." He said, "Yes, it's a big thing. Your problem is you don't shit enough. That's why you're not well. That's why you can't go on to parade." The Greek doctor. Anyway, that was the extent of it. But our hands were completely buggered. They were cracked and bleeding every morning. And the other thing about those parades were that we only had a vest and our overall and the army jersey underneath. You weren't allowed to wear anything over on top. And the big joke was then to come along and grab your hair and say, pull your hair and say, "You're not allowed to wear a Survey jersey." And then everybody would laugh and they'd go and chase us for half an hour because we laughed. I mean, it was all part of the growing up thing. I'll never forget, I was quite young. I was still only 18, I think. And I wasn't shaving every day. And one day, Bebop's host came up to me and said, "Did you shave this morning?" And I said, being the naive little twip that I was, I said, "No," I said, "I only shave every second day." Jeez, like, he went to explain to me that he decides when I shave. He decides when I go to the toilet. He decides when I drink water. He decides when I have a cigarette. Everything about this place is based on his decisions. So we all learned that pretty quickly. We also learned that you never call your rifle your gun. And it just took 1 or 2 guys to learn that lesson. And the thing was that you had to hold your rifle in. This is for shooting, this is for fun. And so it was pretty clear that the lesson that was learned, that you never ever talk about your rifle as your gun. I've mentioned the fact that our webbing was Second World War webbing, which was pretty functional. I mean, there was nothing else on the market, nothing like the fantastic stuff we had, certainly with the Bushmen, where we had the special forces type webbing for a while, and then we got our own brilliant webbing. So it was certainly a long way from where we actually ended up being. But one thing I can say about that time, and I'm talking about 1970, the instructors we had were all Army gym guys. They were the guys that were still the Army gym from Heidelberg. They did their 3 months leadership training, and they either became lieutenants or corporals, and they were brilliant. I'll never forget the lessons that I learned there that I applied later in my career about methods of instruction, part 1, how they with blackboards and with sand models and with other flip chart kind of things that they had, how they taught us and trained us. It was a fantastic experience. And because I was like a sponge, I was just lapping this up and loving every moment of it. It was a fantastic experience. I never forget that if the RSM wasn't happy with our standard on the parade ground, he would take a section of like 21 of the corporals, and one of the staff sergeants would chase them around the parade ground. And then we knew that the cascade was coming down to us, that within the next hour or 2, we'd also be yacht around the parade ground or to the koppies or whatever the case may be. We had some other quite funny things happen. I'll never forget, we had one thing we had in our bungalow. At the end of the bungalow, we had 2 Colonel Lance Corporal, and they were fantastic. I mean, they taught us about packing our equipment. They taught us how to pack our beds and make up our beds. They were actually pretty good in terms of first line response. If somebody was really sick, after crapping him out for an hour, they would then take him to the sick bay. There was no shortcut, but they were there and they were well trained, and they were trained to look after us, and they were held accountable. If we weren't up to standard, they were the ones that were held to account. And that's something I learned later on when I was in Taiwan when I did my parachute training there. And I'll talk about that next week when I have an opportunity again. But we had this one chap one instructor who always used to come into our bungalow and say, "Wat rook ons kerels? What are we smoking, guys?" And then we'd all have to take out our packet and offer him whether it was a Gunston or a Texan or whatever we were smoking in those days. Until towards the end, one guy got enough guts to say, the corporal came in and said, "Wat rook ons kerels? What are we smoking, guys?" And then the one youngster said, "Whatever you've got, corporal, whatever you've got." And that was the last time that he ever bummed a cigarette from us. But we would never have tried that in the beginning, because that would have been an opportunity for him to take us outside and yacht us around a little bit. Yeah, we also had on payday, I don't know how much we got in those days, but it was enough to buy a couple of beers. It was enough to buy sweets and chocolates and all that kind of stuff. And of course, our cigarettes. I'll never forget on payday, the Dames Club, the ladies' club, used to have a massive cake sale there. And then we'd get our money and we'd go there and buy a stack of great bizarre course, from the ladies' club. And there was obviously an arrangement between the ladies' club and the kitchen, because on the days that the ladies' club was selling, for those guys that didn't want to buy from the ladies' club, went to the mess, and the food there was normally just gravy and bones and white bread. So there was obviously some collusion there to encourage us to support the ladies' club. So yeah, that initial basic training of in the middle of 1970 was fantastic. And after that, I got another letter to say that I'd been allocated to Cape Flats Commando. Now, it's a very strange name, especially in today's world, but Cape Flats Commando, it was what in those days was one of the first urban commandos, whereas, of course, the history was of the commandos were all rural. This was one in the urban area. And, of course, at the time of all the trouble that was happening on the Eastern Cape with Polko and all the uprisings that were going on, all the murders of farmers and stuff that were happening there. So they decided, the powers that be decided that the urban areas also needed some commando type people that could also, do cordons and searches and roadblocks and all that kind of stuff. So that's really what the role that the urban commandos were tasked to play. And as I mentioned earlier, we were really at the transition stage, because our group that came in was the first real group of national servicemen, and all the others were older guys, volunteers. Nothing wrong with them. They were first class. Some of them were very regimental, and they taught me a hell of a lot. But a lot of them were very older, and they didn't see things necessarily the same way that we did. In those days, as I mentioned, we had the choice of doing the 9 months or a year, or the basic training plus 16 years of camps. And as I mentioned earlier, I decided that I was not going to be a troop for 16 years. So I decided that I was going to make an active effort to get onto some promotion courses. So I was then given the opportunity in the second part of 1970 to do the section leaders course. And that's when the real fun began, because that's when I realized that the fact that we had crappy equipment, we even had Bren guns. Our LMG, when I did that section leaders course, was the old Bren. But we had two paratrooper instructors. One was a lieutenant, one was a staff sergeant. Absolutely top class. The fact that they drank a hell of a lot was beside the point, because during the daytime, when they were instructing us, there were no shortcuts. And the quality of training, when I look back after all that I went through subsequently, the quality of training was absolutely brilliant. And what was great about all the courses that I did over the years was that I met a lot of guys who I would subsequently during my career become very good friends with. Some of them were instructors, that were guys who were already in the permanent force, that were instructors on the various courses, and others were students, other guys that I met in other parts of my career. So that was 1970, an incredibly good course. Looking back, it was probably one of the best courses that I ever did. That was in the summer of 1970. It was in Kimberley again. It was appallingly hot. And I just have, history tends to soften things a little bit. And I only have good memories of that training, although it was very tough during a big part of that course. The next year, 1971, I did a course at in Cape Town camp, and it was the Republic Day camp in 1971. And we were supposed to be doing street lining for the parade and everything, which we eventually ended up doing. But the one memory I have is those 4 South African aircraft that slammed into the mountain just near Rhodes Memorial. They misjudged their circuit. They were part of the whole fly past. And I remember where we were training for this parade. We heard these 4 massive explosions. We didn't know what the hell it was. And then we subsequently heard that it was the unfortunate crew that died tragically in this accident. And then in 1972, I did my candidate officers course, another brilliant course, another course with fantastic instructors, some of whom I can happily call my friends to this day, guys who became my friends when I joined the permanent force subsequently. We shared lots of things with the start, the genesis was all those many years ago in 1972. I was, it was more of the same, really. I had a friend with me who went to SACS in Cape Town, and he and I we met on the section leaders course, and we became good mates on this course. We drove up together in his car. So, we had a fantastic time. It was really a tough course. It was also in winter, and it was a great learning curve for us. And then in 1974, in November, I was commissioned as second lieutenant in Cape Flats Commando, and that's when the game really started for me, because I was invited into the family of officers in this Cape Flats Commando, and notwithstanding the fact that we were a commando unit, they were very regimental. Those old guys, they taught me a lot about regimental behavior. We used to wear undress blues, like some of the citizen force units did. We had quite a hectic social life. We used to have a lot of dinners. We used to do a lot of the cocktail circuit. So I met a lot of people, and I'll never forget. One evening we were at a sports day in Silvermine Sports Center near Fishook or Simonstown down there, and we were doing the cocktail circuit. And I'll never forget, there was this Commodore from the Navy and his wife, and I subsequently learned it was Dieter Gerhardt. And I don't know if any of you know who Dieter Gerhardt is, but Dieter Gerhardt was a Commodore at Simonstown, and he was a spy. He and his wife were arrested spying for Russia, which was a massive embarrassment for us. But I should have known at the time, because when we eventually moved around to talk to them, she looked at us in our undress blue, the round collar, and she said, "Oh, are you from the fire brigade?" And then I should have known then that there was something very dodgy about her. So I must admit, when I heard that she was arrested and spent quite a few years in Pretoria Central or wherever she was, that there was a little bit of karma involved there for thinking that we were from the fire brigade. 1975, I did the platoon commanders course, which was another great course. And once again, a great learning curve for me, and also with a new batch of instructors. And 1975 was for me from a semi point of view, because bear in mind, while all these army camps and courses were going on, I was supposed to be studying. That was supposed to be what I was doing, because what I didn't tell you was that when I had a dismal year at UCT in my first year, I only passed one subject out of 3. My dad hooked me by the neck and said, "Off you go, my boy, go and get a job and go look after yourself." Well, I was subsequently able to get a bursary. And so I started full-time at Stel again in 1972. And so I was due to graduate at the end of 1974. And I can proudly say that I because I failed one half subject, Stats B, I didn't graduate with all my mates at the end of 74. I only graduated in early 75. But what I also can tell you is that one of my mates who was desperately trying to get a predicate that he could graduate at the end of 1974 was Johan Rupert. And Johan Rupert chose not to write the exam, and he left without ever graduating from Stellenbosch. And I managed to pass. I hated statistics, but I managed to pass it, and I eventually graduated in the early ceremony in 1975. It was also a great year for me because I got married in August 1975, and my dear wife, who I met in Stellenbosch, I don't think she realized what she was in for marrying me, but she always was. That's tongue in cheek because we have had our headbutts on occasions over the years, but she has always been extremely supportive of me, and I'm probably going to talk about company second in command course, also at the Darnington Combat School, also a new set of instructors, a new set of mates. And then in the latter part of the year, I did my first bush tour as a captain. I went up with my unit commander. He stayed at Grootfontein and worked in the ops room there. And I was sent to go and work in the ops room at Oshikati, what was called 2-sub area, I think it was called in those days, which became Sector 10. And I spent 3 months working in the ops room at 2-sub area, Sector 10. And I worked under the auspices of Commandant Fires van Vieren. And I learned, you cannot believe what I learned in those 3 months. Not only about how to run an ops room and how to, but also because of my interaction with the Air Force. And also the fact that they, my baptism of fire, because from where my desk was as the SO3 Ops, there was a little step going up and there was a hatch. And the one hatch was the radio room and the other hatch was the Air Force. So there was constant traffic between us. And then unbeknown to me, my first night that I did a shift on my own, they pulled this plan together where they were going to provide me with a horrific scenario of what was going on. I know of the guys who were shot on the cut line, and the aircraft couldn't fly in at night time because there was cloud cover. They weren't allowed to fly there because of all kinds of other political issues. And geez, it made me really sweat. But after about an hour of going through the sweat, then a whole lot of the guys came in clapping and with some cake or something they had, and then I was accepted as being part of the team. And I'll never forget that trip. I passed through Grootfontein with my OC. He stayed, as I said, he stayed behind. And I spent a couple of days. There were not a lot of English-speaking guys around, and I've never made it an issue, and I'm not going to make it an issue. I might talk about it a bit more next week, because I have quite strong feelings about it. Because although as I mentioned, there were some idiots that always played the language card. Most of the guys that I met with, and I can figure I met some of my best mates were Afrikaans guys, and some of my worst guys that I met were English-speaking guys. So I never like to generalize about this language thing. But when I saw General Gleeson, a newly appointed Major General in his early 40s, I think he was then, what a role model he was. There was this guy, and I met him, and he was polite, and he was respectful, and he treated me like a human being. And then I heard later that he graduated from the military academy, and I thought, wow, this is the kind of guy that I want to emulate. And and then from there, of course, I went to Oshikati, and I had that fantastic learning experience. And then the next year, 1977, I can't remember what I did then, but 1978, I did my company commander's course, which was a fantastic course. Bear in mind that all this training that we've been doing all these years was COIN, counterinsurgency. It was not conventional training. So to think the massive jumps that I would have to take to become a permanent force guy and catch up on all that training was something which I didn't realize what an uphill battle it was going to be. But I carried on with my life. I went to go and pay off my bursary. I was newly married. Sorry, I'm just putting my crib notes back here. And then in 1979, well, there's some dispute about that, whether I asked my wife's permission or not. She says I never did. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I joined short service, and I was posted as the second in command of 5-3 Battalion at Ondangwa. And my wife and I were living in a beautiful little cottage in Constantia. She had a great job at the University of the Western Cape. I had a pretty good job as a graduate, so we were earning a nice little double salary. And our first baby was on its way. And then it must have been, in retrospect, it must have been a hell of an experience, because I joined in March. I drove up from Cape Town in my Passat that I had then, with my English pointer with me. And we rocked up at this double wide, as they say in America, this caravan, mobile home, with white sand around it, white bamboo sand, and a big couple of big marula trees in the garden. And that was going to be our home for the next 2 years. And needless to say, my wife got a hell of a shock when she got there, because a couple of months later in May, our first child was born, and I went down to fetch her and brought her back up. And it was a bit of a shocker, especially because my job as 2RC and 5-3 was a very active job. 5-3 Battalion in those days, for those of you that don't know, there were four. There was 5-1, 5-2, 5-3, and 5-4. These were basically skeleton headquarters that were established in what was called 2 military area in those days. They were basically these headquarters, which and stuff. And then they were the part-time forces or national service units would come in and provide companies. And these companies would be deployed at bases. We had 4 bases in 5-3. And they were right from Italy at the top to Okankoro down on the road to Oshivela. And it was a fantastic experience for me, because having not had a lot of regimental experience, certainly as far as full-time forces are concerned, it suddenly exposed me to a guy like, eventually became Major General Bernardi, who was then a Commandant, Force Bernardi, and he took me under his wing. And he didn't have to. He was kind. He was a hell of a hard taskmaster, and there was no shortcuts with him. He saw himself as being my mentor, I think, and he was very good to me. I'll tell you next week about another couple of incidents involving him. But he took me under his wing, and he made it like an ongoing course, working for him as his 2RC. There was never a day that I didn't learn something really important. My job then was to run the ops room, to look after all the support for all the guys that are coming in terms of liaising with the log and liaising with the training areas, all that kind of stuff. So, and of course the base security and liaison with the Air Force. The Air Force base was a couple of k's away at the Air Force, a couple of k's away from the town where we were. So there was a lot of liaison going with the Air Force, and I became very good mates with the guys at the Air Force base, and so on. You know, in those days, of course, we're talking about 1979, and some people would say it was the darkest days of apartheid. But I can tell you, having had time to think about it, that, and I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories. The one is about Commandant, as he was then, Bernardi. And we had these citizen force units that would come in, do a couple of days training at Oshivela or whatever it was, come up to us, spend a day or 2 in the transit camp, and then they would be deployed to whichever base they were going to. And I'll never forget, we also had the white kids, if you like, the family members' kids. Used to have to go from Oshivela, from Ondangwa to Oshikati to the school. And we had 2 hippos, those early mine-proof vehicles, which the kids used to bring their blankets, and they'd get picked up at home, they'd get lifted onto the vehicles. But this particular time, the company that was there were from the SACC. And perfect, there was absolutely no problem. And until it was their turn on the roster to use the swimming pool. And then some people in the town, the civvies said, no, we don't want these coloured soldiers swimming in our swimming pool. And so Force Bernardi, who by all accounts was a conservative Afrikaner guy who grew up in Zeerust, he said, no, that's fine. Well, if you want to play that game, that's fine. So the next morning, when the kids, when the hippos arrived to take the kids to school, there were no soldiers there. There were no escorts. And the mayor, the so-called civvy mayor of the town, phoned the commandant in despair and said, "Where's your trooper? Where are the soldiers?" He said, no. If they're not good enough to swim in the swimming pool, then they're not good enough to do the escort. And that's the lesson I learned from Force Bernardi. There was absolutely no favoritism, whether you were a citizen force guy or a permanent force guy or a Black 3 Battalion guy or a Cape Corps guy. You were treated exactly the same way. I'll never forget there was quite a well-known, in fact, a very well-known citizen forces regiment. And in those days, they were only deploying companies. But this regiment sent the battalion commander as the company commander so that he could also get some operational experience, which we used to get quite a lot of. And this particular guy, I won't mention the name because I don't want to embarrass him, but we had this brilliant program of orientation where the INT obviously briefed the guys. I briefed them on all the other do's and don'ts. Then the commandant had his turn and gave the whole spiel about, the ops plan and the whole thing. And when he walked out, he called his company sergeant major and he said, "Carry on, sergeant major." And Commandant Bernardi looked at him and come back in here. "What is this all about? Carry on, sergeant major." He says, "No, I've heard the thing now, and I'm handing it over to him. He can carry." No, he said, "That doesn't work." Closed the door for about another hour and explained to this guy what company deployment drills were all about warning orders and about appreciations and about all that kind of stuff. Well, it was a hell of an embarrassing experience for this guy because he suddenly thought that his job was to make sure that the regimental silver was ready for the formal dinner and whatever. He came down with a massive rude awakening. We also had subsequently another citizen force regiment, and I can mention them because it was rifles, and they sent battalion commander up as the company commander. And I'll never forget, I got a little invitation, beautifully handwritten, coloured in beautifully, because there were no copiers and stuff in those days. A little invitation to attend a formal dinner at their base, their company base. And there were only three of them plus me, sitting around with I was donated a cravat, and I still got it proudly, of the Wit Rifles. There we were with these beautiful menus and this 5 or 6 course formal dinner, just 4 of us it was the commandant, the company 2IC, the company sergeant major, and me. And we had this formal dinner. But the difference between them and the other guys were, these guys got the most important things right first. They prioritized the fact that their number one job there was ops. We had another case of another very famous citizen force regiment from Johannesburg. I won't mention anymore. Absolutely first class. I'd love to be able to mention the guy's name because he had a very big job in Sydney Street. But he was an example of the quality guys that existed in some of the citizen force regiments. So yeah, that was my first year there. We lived in this caravan and we built a fantastic little lapa thing at the back with a big porta pool that was half sunk into the ground. And I'll never forget, we got some cement bricks. I don't know where they came from, but we built a little patio around the pool and whatever. And my wife and I were busy filling the gaps between what do you call it? There's a better word for it. Filling the gaps between the bricks. When suddenly there was a mortar attack, Swapo mortar attack on his name was Tarian Billy. He was the chief, about 5 k's away from north of our base. So I had to rush off to the ops room and obviously go and supervise how we were going to go and deal with this whole thing. And I said to my wife, just carry on, because if we don't keep filling that cement, it's going to harden and then we're going to have a hell of a job. And I'll never forget, she afterwards told me that for about 5 minutes, she carried on filling it in. And she said, the hell with this. And she ran inside, got my daughter out, and went next door to the neighbors where they had the bunkers. And she said to me afterwards, how could you have even thought that I was going to carry on, filling the cement when you were trotting around trying to deal with the situation? Anyway, eventually at the end of 1979, Force Bernardi left. And he made an impression on my life. He eventually went to become Director Infantry, and he kept his eye on me. He was like a godfather to me, I suppose, unwittingly and unknown to me. He kind of looked after me. And then I had another great guy as my next boss. That was Commandant Yori Jordan. Also an old school infantry guy, absolutely dyed-in-the-wool infantryman, brilliant soldier. He eventually, I think, became Brigadier General, maybe a Major General, I'm not quite sure, but he sadly passed away about 2 years ago, as did General Bernardi. And my training continued under the auspices of this other guy. So I was really fortunate, man, because I was exposed to these great guys, and it rubbed off on me big time. The culture that I learned about how to lead people and how to manage people and how to support people and how to run int and how to run ops, and it was ingrained in me by these two great guys. And another example we had of the so-called racist Boer soldiers. We had a citizen force company from somewhere in the East Rand, if I remember correctly, and they refused to shower in the same showers as the 3-2 battalion guys, because we always had 3-2 battalion guys coming through into our little transit camp thing that we had there. So Yori Jordan called the company commander in, and he said, what's the story here? Because I believe there's some of you guys that don't want to shower. He said, there are about 4 or 5 guys that have refused. So Jordan called them in, and he said, look, we don't work like that here. 3-2 battalion guys have got the same blood as you've got, the same blood I've got, the same blood that Adams has got, and we don't have any distinction here on race. If you're good enough to fight together, you're good enough to shower together. So I'm asking you for the last time, are you going to stay or aren't you going to stay? No, they refused. They didn't want to. So he arranged for them to go to Ko'okola, which is right far in the west. And they worked there on some construction site. I don't know what the commandant there was building, but they were building something. These guys slaved away there for 3 months on some construction site in the middle of the desert there in Ko'okola. So there was no question in my mind about how we lived and how we treated each other in those early days. During that time was Op Skeptic, which was later known as Smoke Show. And Commandant Jordan had a command of a battle group. So I was left in command of 5-3 for a couple of weeks. And I'll never forget that during that time, Brigadier Barnhorst was then the OC. And he phoned me one day and he said, what the hell's going on in your area? I know that Commandant Jordan's gone, but I hear nothing from you. What's going on? Are you asleep or what's happening? So luckily for me, we just had a very nice contact down at Okotopi. And I think we killed 8 swapper or 7 or 8 swapper. So I said, no, General, Brigadier, I said, I'm not sure if you haven't got the message yet, but we just had a very successful contact down there, Okotopi, and we killed 7 or 8 swapper. He said, well, why don't I know anything about this? So I immediately got on the phone to my mate, Russell Bartlett, who was SO2 Ops at Oshikati. And I said, you better start running down the passage because the brigadier is on his way. And apparently they met at the steps. And luckily, Russell was able to say, Brigadier, I'm just on my way to tell you about the great contact down at Okotopi. But that was a great experience for me because during that time, while the commandant was away, we had a minor mutiny at 101 Battalion, which was the Ovambo Battalion. And I was called in because Vili, we used to call him Vili Vambo. Vili Vambo, the commandant, was also involved in Skeptic. And he and most of the guys were away, but some of the remnants that were left behind decided to get all Bolshi. And so I and myself and the RSM went across and we very cunningly managed to get them in one by one into a mobile home. And then we disarmed them, and then they went out the other side and were arrested and whatever. But those were the kind of real life situations that we were involved in at the time. The other great opportunity I had during that time was to be detached for about 2 weeks to go and work with General Ferreira, who was then OC 32 Battalion, Falcon, as we called it. And I mean, you just can't put a cost or put a value on spending 2 weeks working hand in hand as the SO2 ops for Falcon when he was running this tactical headquarters at Inanna. I learned so much from that man. It was unbelievable. And I'll never forget, one day we had a great experience when on the airstrip at Inanna, suddenly this twin engine, very smart twin engine civvy aircraft starts trundling down the runway. And we all look out of the tent and look at the runway, and the aircraft stopped at the end, and we immediately thought, well, we've captured the whole command structure of SWAPO. And needless to say, we took the necessary steps and arrested everybody in the vehicle. And it turned out that it was a mining company, a vehicle from a mining company, that their beacon or their homing device locked into our beacon. We had a very strong beacon then at Inanna. And so they thought it was somewhere in Angola that they were landing, but they were actually landing in the mouth of the enemy. So they were all taken down to Windhoek. I don't know what happened to the aircraft, but I think it was probably given back to them subsequently. But the other funny thing, which I've just remembered about that time, was that we had the guy who was at that time the chaplain general of the army, and he was a wonderful little character. I just can't remember his name now. And my tent, that a couple of us that were on detached duty were living in, was next to the pollution block, and his tent was right next door to ours. And I remember one morning I heard this whistling coming along. It was pretty cold there, even though it was, everybody thinks of Wambeland is always hot, but it was very cold there in the winter months. I heard this little voice of this guy coming along, singing, whistling, and singing along. Then I hear the shower opening, and I hear this voice say in Afrikaans, "Come out, you little coward! I just want to wash you." And it was the chaplain general that was battling to have a shower in this bitterly cold weather, because it was just tarpaulins with IBR sheeting. There was a big gap at the bottom and a big gap at the top. So yeah, that was quite a fantastic experience. So I enjoyed my time with Falcon, and yeah, it was really great. That year, also 1979, I was gearing myself up for my PF career, and I had to do 2 courses as a matter of urgency before they would even consider me for permanent appointment. And the one was mechanized orientation. And Russell Bartlett, as it happens, and I were sent down to do a course in Bloemfontein, also in the freezing cold winter, in De Brugge, racing around in rattles for 3 weeks. A wonderful learning experience. I also had the opportunity to meet a guy that would become a friend of mine later on, was Commandant Savades, Tony Savades in those days. Also met Major Andre Kruger, he's still a friend of mine to this day. And it was, once again, it's just part of this building block. You know, I was just getting more and more of these fantastic learning opportunities. And then later in the year, we were sent down to infantry school to do it was called battle handling for unit commanders. It was also a 3-week course, and there were a lot of permanent force guys on it. In fact, Johan Jooster, who became a friend of mine, and he eventually took over the Bushman from me in 1985, 86, whenever around about there. And he became a major general. He stayed on and became a major general. We became friends. We're still friends. Johan, he was with me on this course. We were only about 12, and it was a very nice course. And I also met Wessel Kritzinger, who was the colonel, OCF Infantry School at the time. Of course, in those days and now, we on first name terms. I call him General or Sir, and he calls me Brian. But he's a client of mine now, General Kritzinger, and we get on very well. And that was the first time that I met him all those years ago in 1980. So it was all part of this whole process of growing. One of the shocking things about that time was because there was no Trust Bank. My bank account in Cape Town was Trust Bank. When I moved up to Oshakati or Ndangwa, it was only a First National Bank. In those days, it was called, what was it called in those days? Barclays. And so I transferred my account to Barclays, but unbeknown to me, they didn't transfer my life insurance policy. And I woke up with a shock in the last half of 1980 to realize that I'd been running around Ovambaland for 19, 20 months without any life cover. Anyway, that was a massive, huge awakening, but that was all part of the whole thing. I did a lot of flying in those days, a hell of a lot of flying. Bospok mostly, some kudu, a lot of time in the Alouettes. We used to sit on the toolbox in the front of the Alouette. That's why I've got a very bad neck, because I used to spend hours and hours sitting in the front of an Alouette while we were observing stuff and doing fire control, army commander in the air kind of stuff. I also met Tekle Kiesler at that time. I don't know if you've heard about him, but he was a commando pilot in Namibia or Southwest in those days, and he had a gadget, a pipe that you used to sit between the legs of the passenger, and in that pipe was a cotter pin, an HE hand grenade, a white phos hand grenade, an HE with another little cotter pin with a little chain on it. And the plan was that if he flew into an area where there was a contact, you would just pull the bottom cotter pin and these things would go shooting out. Well, very sadly, happily, I never had to use those things, and I spent hours flying with that guy. But sadly, that thing eventually caused his death because he had a crash land, and the thing popped out, and the two grenades and the white phos apparently burnt the whole plane, and it was quite a dreadful story. So yeah, and then I went for permanent force selection, which was a couple of days in Pretoria, a lot of tests, a lot of interviews. I never for a moment going to be selected. I mean, I was very windgat, but I never for a moment thought that I wasn't going to be accepted. Because I did have a degree, I had paid my dues, I paid my school fees, I had 2 years in the operational area, and then I went for the final interview. I think there were 2 brigadiers and a major general. I think the major general was Len Meyer. I think he was chief army staff person. And I'll never forget, he said to me, well, what is your career objectives? And I said to him, I want to be chief of the army. And I'll never forget, he looked at the brigadier on the left, he looked at the brigadier on the right, he said, well, there's no problem with your self-confidence. You come a khat. And that was it for me. I eventually then disappeared into the middle distance, feeling quite confident that I was going to be appointed. Anyway, I was appointed, and it was made quite clear to me that my next year was going to be a catch-up year, where I was going to have to catch up with a lot of my permanent force colleagues who had been from second lieutenant and we worked their way up to major. And I understood that, and it was quite clear to me that I had no difficulty with that whatsoever. Some of my friends later, and we had our staff course reunion, our 40th reunion a couple of weeks ago, and I reminded one of the guys that he told me one day that I was one of the guys that came in through the back door. And then I was quite put out by that in the beginning. And then I realized that I had actually nothing to be ashamed of, that I'd also paid my dues. I'd gone through the same courses with him. In fact, he and I were on battle group together, which happened now in 1981. 1981, out of the kindness of their hearts, the army decided to send me to Cape Town because my wife's mom lived in Durbanville. And so they sent me as the second in command of one SACC, one SA Cape Corps. And on the understanding that I was going to be away a lot because I had to do battle group, I had to do pre-course for staff course. And unbeknown to me at that time, we were also going to do Operation Protea. So we happily, my wife and I and my one daughter, we happily moved down to our little house in Somerset West. It was a civvy house that they hired for us. It was beautiful, very nice. And I got stuck into my new job at one SSCC, which in those days was a powerhouse. It was, we were turning out 1,500 soldiers twice a year. So it was a massive training depot. And eventually there was a second SACC battalion, and the soldiers that were trained, the companies that were trained, were then passed across to 2 SACC, and they were, of course, earmarked for border duty, which a lot of the guys did. I had, once again, I had the opportunity to work with an absolutely brilliant guy, Vinnie Stradom. He also sadly died a couple of years ago. Willie had an MBA. You know, he was one of the guys that I really admired, because apart from the fact that he'd had a great career in the army, he'd also showed that he had a lot more depth in terms of his academic ability. And he taught me a lot about MBA type stuff, about management, about leadership, and especially about how to be the training officer, which in fact I was as a second in command, of how to train these 3,000 soldiers a year in this training depot, how to interact with the guys there, because there were very few white guys. Most of the guys that were there were colored guys. And it was, once again, it was a culture change for me. Although having grown up in Cape Town, I was, you know, I obviously knew a lot of colored guys, but working with them as a team, working in the same thing, and finding once again that there was absolutely no racial thing. You know, if the guy was an officer, you saluted him. If he wasn't an officer, he wasn't an officer. There was none. There was, I'll never forget our lieutenants that traveled on courses, traveled first class like white lieutenants did. There was no distinction at all between the races in those days. And I was very proud of that. But I learned so much from Billy, and I think I must take my hat off to him. I'm sorry he's not here to hear this, but the fact that he put up with an absentee 2RC for a big chunk. My wife says I was away for 8 months, but I think that might be a little bit of an exaggeration. But in fact, I was away from March to May on battle group. That was a huge learning curve. It was at Lahatla, at the Army Battle School. We were one of the first courses that were actually done because the courses up until then were done from the Army College. So we were actually at the Army Battle School, and we had actual troops. There was a company, there was a battery of artillery, there was a company of infantry, and there was a company of armor. And we used to do, actual training with these companies. So it was a massive experience. But the biggest learning curve for me was the fact that for the first time, I was exposed to conventional warfare. Because up until then, as I said a few moments ago, I was a coin man. And all my time on the border, we had no exposure to conventional warfare whatsoever. That was all to come with Hooper and Packer and all those things subsequently. So, the Army Battle School, what an experience. It was bitterly cold. But putting that aside for the moment, as we always do, we always seem to remember the good things. I made some good mates. And a lot of them were guys that are still my mates today that were with me on various other courses and various other deployments over the years. And one of the things that I can remember, which in retrospect was very funny, but at the time was hair-raising. I was, as we are in students, we get appointed as a battle group commander for the day. And it was my day. We did the appreciation that we always had to do. I had to give orders, and then the guys were divvied up into the various jobs. And my friend Russell was the company commander, and a company commander from 5-star, I think, in Rattles. And his job was to provide support fire from Copy number 2 on Copy number 1, which was our major objective. We had the battery of 25 pounders behind us, and I had Div, who was the battery commander, with me in my Rattle. And we've gone through all the process, everything. The plan was that Russell was going to put support fire, the artillery were going to put support fire, and then the other 2 companies would attack from the left or whatever. I can't remember. But something just told me, as it often does, and in my life it's often been the case, a little voice on my shoulder said, phone Russ, get Russell on the radio and tell him to get his guys back into their Rattles. So I got on to Russell and I said, Russell, just get your guys back into the Rattle. He said, this is supposed to be a realistic exercise. You're messing us around here, man. The guys have dug in and right on top of a blue copy there. So I said, Russell, just humor me. And I knew him well enough, and he kind of got the vibe from me, and he got the guys back in. So I said to Div, right, Div, fire, So there's Div and I with our binocs on objective number 1. And this whole battery of fire landed up on top of Russell's company corporal. And the only incident we had was we had one guy who was closing his hatch, got a bit of shrapnel in the arm, and a couple of tires of the rifles that were obviously blown to smithereens. But I often wake up in the middle of the night and I say, what if I hadn't listened to that little voice? And we'd had 150 guys on a rocky kopje in the middle of the Army Battle School. God, I would never have lived it down. Needless to say, Div and I had a couple of quiet ones afterwards that evening, and I think we only stopped shaking after about the third or fourth double. But that was the kind of training that we had in those days, and it was a real learning experience. The other slightly light-hearted story we had was there was nowhere to go in those days. Our nearest town was Portsmouthburg, and Portsmouthburg had a hotel in it. And we used to go there for steaks, like once a week or once every 2 weeks we'd go, or once a month maybe on payday. We'd get dressed up in our blazers and go through to the hotel. There was a quite delightful young lady that worked in reception there. And everybody was trying to hit, well, not everybody, I mean, a lot of the guys were trying to hit on her. So they decided, somebody showed up one day with one of his shoes. I don't know where he got it from. He's never told us. But the long story was that we mounted the shoe on a little wooden base that somebody got the hold of. And that was the prize for the first guy that claimed her scalp, basically, as it were. So anyway, the long of the short of the story, eventually we have the course party at the end of the course, and some of the wives and some of the girlfriends arrived. And the idiot, I don't know who it was, some idiot decided that he had to present this trophy to the guy. And so somebody elbowed him in the ribs and said, look, stop this, just cut it out, forget about it. Anyway, so one of my mates said afterwards, that's the one trophy that he would have loved to have qualified to have been awarded, but the one that he would have least liked to have been in front of his girlfriend. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the plug was pulled on that one, and we lived to see another day. So then I got, after battle school, my wife came to fetch me. She had family, or she has family in that area, so she spent a couple of days with them, and then we hit the road back to Cape Town and back to my regimental duties with SACC. During that time, I got a couple of boxes of books, which were my learning material for my staff course, which, as you probably know, is the MBA of an Army guy's career. In fact, in America, it's got the same, enjoys the same academic standing as a master's degree, but for some reason or other, it was never pursued here. But for those of us that attended the course, which I'll talk a little bit more about next time, I think. Yeah, next time. No, I'm going to talk about it now. It was a hell of a learning experience for us. So got back home, started studying. We were called to Pretoria to go and do our pre-course. And there were 80 of us, 80 of Army guys. There was one Air Force guy or two Air Force guys, but we were 80. And we started studying. We all had our own little rooms, and we started studying in preparation for this exam. But I had a friend of mine, a recce, who was with me on battle group, and he'd been with me on that battle handling we done at Oudtshoorn. And he whispered to me, don't study too hard, because he's heard through the grapevine that we're actually going to go to op Protea. But I didn't want to just completely accept what he did. So I sort of hedged my bets a little bit, and we had some good times together, and we partied a bit. And then one Saturday morning, we were called to the Generalskamer up at the top of the the Army College. And in walked, as he was then, Brigadier Kat Liebenberg. He was the Director of Operations. And he said, guys, change your plan. You've got a couple of days to sort yourselves out. We're going to do a big operation called Operation Protea. It's going to be the biggest operation that South Africa's ever done. And you guys as senior students, or students to be next year, and the students that were on staff course that year, all going to be divided up and deployed as part of the various formations and so on. So my wife and I because I'd had an inkling about this from my friend, we had a code word. So it was Donald Duck, I'll never forget. And she asked me how I was going. So I said, well, Donald Duck has come to visit. So then immediately she knew that, because we were very strict on security in those days. You know, I don't know if it was always like that, but we took it quite seriously. Maybe we were very naive, but we certainly took it very koptu. And anyway, we cut a long story short, within the next couple of days, we were on our way. And once again, I had the privilege of being appointed as the second in command of Battle Group 60, which had 3 companies of 3-2 Battalion, a small headquarter element, and my commander then was Commandant James Hills, also a paratrooper. And he stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and then he was called away. He had to go and attend a training course overseas. And another great guy, Major as he was then, Hannes Venter, who was a recce. He was OC of 4 recce eventually. He was actually on staff course that year, on 1981. And he was my commander. Well, I couldn't have wished for better mentors, because I learned so much from those 2 guys in that time. And our job was, I don't know if you know, I'm not going to go through the whole battle or the whole operation, but it was a hell of an operation. I mean, our job, and I will never forget, we were part of some 3-2 guys and I were dropped off at a heli admin area right north of Arjiva. We were 4 of us, with 4 3-2 guys and myself, and about a section of 3-2 soldiers. And our job was to provide early warning of things that were happening in the area. And I'll never forget, one night we were sitting there, we had our trenches dug and everything, and I think we were having a quiet nightcap or whatever it was, sundowner. And I looked ahead of me, and right due north, a flare went up. And it suddenly dawned on me, well, I mean, we didn't see flares all the time there, I mean, quite obviously. And it suddenly dawned on me that there was somebody that was putting a marker down, and he had plans to mortar the hell out of us. So I called in an airstrike of Impalas. Well, I didn't know they were going to be Impalas, but we were sitting there. By then it had got dark, and we watched the light show as these guys came and bombed this tree line where we expected the guys to be assembling. Well, needless to say, we weren't attacked that night. And the next morning we found, because I think they used napalm, which I don't think I'm still allowed to talk about, but the bush, that area was just charcoal, and we found some things that might have been rifles previously in another life. But anyway, that was it. Anyway, I've cut a long story short. We then were taken out of there, and we joined up with Commandant Hills and his headquarters, and we established our headquarters at Mupa. Mupa's a little town on the main road up to Kalawe, to Techmatet and that area. And our job was basically to provide an ops and admin area, but also to command the 3-2 companies who were stopper groups in the area to the northeast of Ongiva, where this major battle took place. So what happened on the great day when the thing arrived? A lot of the Russians and a lot of the Cubans and a lot of the other guys headed northeast, right into the teeth of our stopper groups. And some of the 3-2 youngsters did brilliantly that day. The one youngster was responsible for they had nothing. They just had RPGs, but they shot out a BRDM. They captured a couple of Russians. And wife was killed in this action. And I actually recommended him for a medal because of the great job that he'd done. And sadly, the guy that was in the spotter aircraft above us, he was giving us the wrong information all the time. He got an SM, I think, for confusing the hell out of everybody on the ground. And the guy who was actually right in the middle of the battle, a brilliant youngster. I don't know whatever happened to him, but he was one of those absolutely first-class platoon commanders that 3-2 and my guys in 3-1 eventually had a lot to be proud of. First class. So, yeah, we had that I also at that time I renewed another friendship I had with the guy who was the OC of 95 Tactical Air Force Unit on Dongwei in 79 and 80 when I was there, Basil Newham. He was a wet helicopter pilot, and during Protea, unbeknown to me at the time, he was the MAOT, the Mobile Air Operation Team that was attached to Battle Group 6 Sierra, which was Hills. And Baz was a major organizer. There was nothing that guy couldn't organize. And so on our vehicle, Biffles mostly, we carried all the dry goods like the potatoes and the onions and the other veggies. And Basil would make sure that on the last helicopter run that evening, we would get ice and we would get fresh meat. So our little crowd always had stuff. We always had provisions, proviant. And so much so that it was like the famous stopover. We had a lot of visitors, VIPs, that stopped over there. I'll never forget one night we had a late contact and I had a lot of admin to do, being the 2IC. I had all the staff work and stuff to do. So it was dark and I trundled down from our little base to where the Air Force were, and I was shouting the odds about some of us having to work and other ones to sit and drink and so on. And then an arm grabbed me out of the darkness, and it was General Kelly. And he said to me, "Now, stop disrupting the good relations that we enjoy between ourselves and the Air Force. Pour yourself a dop and get something out of the poikie." And unbeknown to me, he had actually, now lying, it was, of course, known to me. That afternoon, earlier that day, he walked from the helicopter pad, he walked out of the thing up to our little base. And we built with shade net around the bottom of a massive tree, which in retrospect was probably not the brightest plan. But anyway, to cut a long story short, we built our little HQ there, and we had a cage of lovebirds, which had been liberated from one of the houses there, because there was not a lot going on. A lot of the Portuguese were really long gone. But there was this little ruined house with the lovebirds, and this was in our headquarters. And he walked in, completely unbeknown to us, unannounced. And he started chatting to us. "Can we have a cup of coffee?" Yes, got him a cup of coffee, chatting. And he said, "Well, I've got to go to Europe. I've got to catch a flight out tonight because I'm going to be in Europe tomorrow or the next day, whenever it was." I'm just trying to I'm confusing myself with two incidents here. But anyway, that particular day, he said to me, "What do you guys do about showering here?" So I said, "Well, I've got CO van der Merwe. He's my sort of Batman." He was actually on leader group course at the School of Personnel Service School, and he was my sidekick, my ops guy, my ops clerk, my admin guy, my Batman, whatever it was. I said, "No, CO van der Merwe, we've got a 25 liter drum. He'll heat it up and he'll call you when it's ready and you can go to the shower." We showered just behind the Mopani bush there. And being the guy he is, I looked out about half an hour later. There was this white guy, very white guy, standing in the middle of this of the Mopani trees, having a good old shower, like a wash, like we did. And then he disappeared. And the next minute I said to Van der Merwe, I said to him, "Where's the general?" He said, "You won't believe it, sir, go and have a look." And I went to my trench, and there he was lying. Now, our trenches there, we got some cuff from the trough from where they used to thresh the millies. And I got my guys, the 3 guys, I got them to fill up my trench about 300 millimeters, and then put our ground sheets down on it. So we slept like babies there. Anyway, I walked up to my trench, and there the general is fast asleep on my bed, because we had camp beds. I had a camp bed on top of this thing. Anyway, and there he was with the newspaper over his head, and he was fast asleep. So that must have been earlier the day before, the night of me running into him again at the Air Force. And then the next day he disappeared. And he expressed a lot of interest in those lovebirds, which were Van der Merwe's. And as the story unfolded, Van der Merwe, when he got leave, he took those birds and actually took it to the general's house and gave it to him, because the general was very keen on he had an aviary at home and all those kind of good stuff. So yeah, that was Basil Newham. He was always organizing stuff for us. And then on the way out, we were the first in and the last out, because by then James had gone and Hannes was the OC. and he had a little bit. He had a couple of tasks that we had to do before we left. So we stayed the night at a place called Nahoni, which was one of the targets that we'd had on the way through. And one of my helicopter mates, Hojan Cronier, Honoris Crooks, brilliant guy, absolute gentleman. He walked into my little HQ there in this ruined or half-ruined building in Nahoni. And he said, Brian, I've got a little surprise for you. And out of his long pocket of his flying suit, he pulled out a bottle of Clipper. So there we were on this last night, and a couple of us, about 5 or 6 of us, and we looked to see what we were going to do. We had a huge tin of Japanese tuna. We had a tin of condensed milk from Holland, a gift from Holland for the people of Angola. We had some onions and some potatoes. We had some olive oil, a gift from the people of Portugal. So I said, look, we're going to make tuna salad and French fries, chips. So I got my little team going, and there we were in the middle of Angola, having a quiet sundown or two with beautiful tuna salad with mayonnaise that I made from the olive oil and condensed milk with a little bit of mustard powder. We made a sort of a gung-ho little version, and what a great time. The only thing that upset us a little bit was that afternoon there was a scare that there were a whole lot of Angolan troops on the way to us, and that turned out eventually to be a false alarm. But an idiot in Impala, probably a Mirage, did a low flight over our headquarters. And well, apart from the fact that he scared the bloody living hell out of us, it turned out that he nearly demolished this old ruin that we were in, because honestly the walls were, because the Mirage flying over at 100 foot. These old buildings are not really made to last long. So yeah, that was it. After that, we had a week's leave, and I went. It was the day that it snowed in Johannesburg, 1981, and I had a week's leave and went back to Cape Town, came back, and then we started the pre-course in earnest. It was a hell of a course. So much so that of the 80 that started, of the 80 that started, there were 21 South Africans that eventually were selected to pass the course. And the one thing about it was, I am going to talk about the staff course itself next week. But the one thing about this course was, I'm going to talk about it next week. But the one thing about it, I must say, is that at that stage, I didn't really appreciate or realize what a massive privilege I was going to have the next year. Because I spoke to all my guys subsequently in all my command positions that I had, and I told them what an absolute privilege and staff course. But there's always, the Army always has its way of doing things, and we were in accommodation right at the bottom of the road, away from the old building. But the colonel's office was next to the garden, next to the swimming pool. And the way the Army works is it's alphabetical from commandant to major. There were a couple of commandants on the course, a couple of majors. So it was all the commandants were called first. And then the last commandant was Eddie Viljoen, who was my mate. And we'd known each other on a lot of courses, and of course, had known each other in the old days in the Dongwa too. And we did battle group together. So he was the last of the commandants, V for Viljoen, and I was the first of the majors, A for Adams. And the way it worked in the psychological warfare department in those days was, when the one guy had gone into the colonel's office and got the good news or the bad news, then the next chap had to come up the road and join the other poor chap in the garden. So as it happened, Viljoen was waiting. The guy in front of him had just gone through and got the good news or the bad news. And the first major, Adams, A, was the guy away. So Eddie and I met up in the garden. We were actually quite terrified, to be quite honest. But that's the psychological warfare part of the whole thing, because none of us knew at that stage how well we'd done, because it was a hell of a challenging thing. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Eddie and I both made it, and then we walked through the colonel's office, down the road, and then with the waves and cheers, and it was a hell of a relief. And then we went back home, back to Cape Town, and told to be back in January for the start of our next experience. And what an experience it was. The big challenge for me was obviously the logistics, because I had my little family in Cape Town, and I had to now plan to be in Johannesburg for a year. And there was certainly no way that I was going to keep her in Cape Town. And so luckily her sister lived at that stage on the West Rand, and we were able to stay, or she was able to stay with, we had to stay in, she was able to stay with her sister. And then eventually during the course of 1982, we bought a little house in Centurion. And that was the start of the serious part of my journey. So what I decided to do, Chris, was to, in the first talk today, is just to talk about the run-up to, if you like, to my PF life, and then how it unfolded and how it blossomed in terms of opportunities that I had from 1982, and then the Bushmen, and then my chance as the Armed Forces Attaché in the Republic of China in Taipei. And then, you know, the Army, I had a house in Pretoria, that little house that I bought, and I had a half house that my dad and I bought as an investment in Cape Town. But the Army, in their wisdom, didn't send me back to Pretoria or to Cape Town. They sent me to Durban. But, you know, I believe there was a bit of divine intervention there, because my life would never have turned out the way it had done if I had gone to Cape Town or Pretoria. So, yeah, we had to make our plan to move and get ourselves sorted. And then the big adventure of 1982 started. So that's where unless you have any questions, Chris, that's where I'd like to end the first section.
It's just fascinating for me to hear this, because I keep on asking officers of your age whether the Army actually knew there was going to be a war going on. And it seems to me they were quick enough to realize that there's going to be trouble, and they were building up to this. Now, you were talking about your basics, and as funny as it was also very tough. And just yesterday, we recorded Brigadier General Jock Harris, who was one of the council members, actually, of the Untitled Chapter. And he was... That's
where I met him. That's where I met him the first time. And interestingly enough, that battle handling course that I did in infantry school with Johan Jooste and others, Jock was actually our course leader on that course. So I got to know him at Donny Turon and subsequently at infantry school. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're welcome, sir. And he was also very funny how he was telling the background, a lot of things there. But I need to ask you a question now. It seems to me that the military in modern days, and let's call it NATO militaries, has turned woke. I've had some of my viewers here contact me, and they would say to me, well, the one son was actually doing a basics in the US Army, and this is recent, a year ago. And if they get too tired, then they can actually pull time out or something. And I have to ask your opinion, sir, because the military is actually a very, very serious organization. I mean, people do die there, and going to war is probably the most serious thing you can do as a human being. These methods were used on new people. Do they work? Is it effective?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to tell you next week about some of the things that I did at Amiga with the Bushmen, and some of the fantastic leader group guys I had in my team, and how serious we were about things like operational discipline, about proper training. I don't want to spoil it for next week, but what I can tell you is I mentioned RSM Gous, Bebops, as he was called. And I'll never forget, you just reminded me of it now. One day, I think it was maybe on our the winter of 1970, there were 1,500 of us on this basic course. And we were all sitting in a massive group, and he started to talk to us. And what was really cool about RSMs in those days, and I've had some really good RSMs. I'll tell you another story quickly. No, I'll keep it for next week, about my own RSM. But Gous started telling us that the group that are gathered in front of him, 10 are going to die, 5 are going to be in motor vehicle accidents. And suddenly, the guy suddenly realized that statistically, the chances were very, very good that somebody's going to die during the time that they doing their military call-ups. So the leopard crawl we used to do over rocky ground and stuff like that. I think some of it was certainly brutal, and it was probably not necessary. If one thinks about it that way, but it all added to this kind of quality of training that we had in those days, where there were no prisoners. Now, what I didn't tell you was that one of the courses we had, it was also in the middle of winter, freezing cold. In fact, a lot of us were sleeping with our water bottles as pillows when we slept. And the water bottle, when we woke up in the morning, was frozen. We had a balaclava on. I'll never forget the one guy who had the radio mic on in our little section. There was a big piece of frost here where his voice had frozen onto the thing. And then the instructors decided, no, they're going to have some fun with us. So they pitched a 16 by 16 tent at one of the rendezvous points that we had to get to. And they said, okay, it's very cold. You guys can have an hour's chill. You can chill here for an hour in the tent. No fires, you're not allowed to make fires, but you're allowed to just get a bit of, and then they disappeared again. Now we thought, it's too good to be true. If the instructors start being kind to you, then you must know there's something happening. True enough, it was a tent where somebody had exploded a tear gas canister. And with the moisture in the air and the dew during the night, we had all pulled into this tent and thought we were going to get a quick hour's shut-eye. And then this tear gas mist started coming down. So, there was no, I suppose from a human rights point of view, there were some issues there. But I mean, I think somebody once said, every drop of blood you spend training is a drop of blood saved when the real battle comes. And so, yeah, there was no human rights.
I think it's a very responsible position to be an officer. And I remember in those years, I went straight to the police. I wanted to be in the police. I remember that some of the officers would come on the television and they would assure the parents that their boys were in good hands. Now, of course, these young men, I said it to General Jock the other day, that it's beyond belief what the army did with the young man, how much training you can get into that young body, and then getting to operate something as magnificent as a Rattle or a G5 or parachuting down, things like that. It's just amazing. But I have to ask you, sir, did you ever feel pressure upon you that these men are looking up to you? You're standing alone on that parade ground, you're leading them into battle. How does that feel?
Yeah, look, I always believed, and I must actually say that some of the old guys from Cape Flats Commando taught me a lot of regimental lessons. And one of them was that, there's the old saying in the army from the days of the cavalry, first the horses, then the men, then the officers. And I was brought up under that school, that the first thing you look after is your troops. Well, the horses. You make sure. So, and my family, they get so irritated with me because when we go away for a drive or we go away for a weekend, when we come back, I insist that we take out the kit, that we clean it, that we repack it, that we clean the car, that we pack away all this stuff, because that's the way we used to do it in the army. It's when you go away on an operation, you come back and you make sure your kit is perfect. You fill up your vehicles and you make sure your radio batteries are being charged. Everything is ready for when you're going to be called up again. Then, as an officer, you make sure that your troops are looked after, that they always eat. That's why in the tradition of the army, you have the duty officer, and his job is to go and eat with the troops. He doesn't eat in the officers' mess. He has a place in the troops' mess, and he sits and eats what they eat, because that we have to show as officers that we absolutely care about our troops, like we cared about our horses in the old days, like we cared about our soldiers in the old days. The whole thing about foot inspections, about all that stuff, that's operational discipline. And we were taught that from the early days of section leader course, all the courses that we did. was that our troops are our most important asset. And it's what I was really going to say, it's a responsibility. It's a hell of a responsibility. And I realized in retrospect, subsequently, that the best support I got from my guys that were under my command were the ones who saw in me somebody who was actually setting an example of me actually caring for them first, and then they'll take care of me. And the caring for them doesn't mean a soft touch. It means making sure that they fit, making sure that the equipment is properly cared for and looked after, making sure that they get the best equipment, making sure that when they get deployed, that they're not being abused and misused by a commander that they might have been attached to. It's providing them with top cover. It's providing them with support. It's providing them with encouragement. And yeah, look, it was a massive responsibility being a commander. And I think next week I'll be able to talk a little bit more about some of the instances where I actually lost guys. And how do you respond? I mean, even in this time, with the stuff that I covered today, especially at SACC, I had opportunities to go to funerals. And the one sad day, and I'll mention the name of the blooming town, if I can remember it. I can see it in my ear now, but in my eyes. In fact, I can't remember the name. Probably good that I don't remember. But one of the SACC youngster was killed in a contact. And my wife and I, representing the unit, plus the RSM and a couple other people, went to this funeral. And it was in a town in the Cape. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the town, but probably better that I don't. Anyway, the mayor decided that we weren't allowed to have the drive past and the march past in the town. We had to do it in the colored area. He didn't want the soldiers and the band and everything to happen in the white area. That was 1981. So even though we were guys who were really looking after our guys and setting an example as far as this so-called New South Africa is concerned, and we still had these blockages. So we had this massive funeral in the coloured area, as it was then, and the mayor and his council didn't participate at all. So it was a bittersweet. I certainly saw a massive responsibility in being a commander, about how the guys ended up and how they were treated. But you can only go so far. You can only do as best as you can under the circumstances. And yeah, I'll tell you more next week.
No, that's good. That's good. We had, of course, Colonel Nick Mostert, Menoris Kritzholler was also at the Color Corps, I believe, and Saki Marais, I believe he was also around there, the former paratrooper. Well, I suppose he's still a paratrooper, but I wouldn't like to say he was a former one. But thank you for this. We really appreciate your talk. It's 2 hours, would you believe? And it's 2 hours well spent. Well spent. I really enjoyed this. Thank you. And I want to say to the rest of you out there, if you have a story, please come and tell me. Come and talk to me so that we can build up a legacy here. These are these small things which will never get into a book. And talking about a book, so if you're writing a book, we want to know about it. We most definitely want to know about that book. And once it's done or it's published, please come and tell us about it. But until next week, when we will be talking further about your career, and I suppose we'll have to ask you what happened to you afterwards, just to complete the story. Until we meet again, God bless.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you.